The offer came on a Thursday morning in October, when the maple trees along Queen Street had gone amber and the smell of rain was everywhere, and Harlow Quaid had exactly $47 in her account and an overdue notice from the care home taped to her fridge. She thought the job sounded simple: private caretaker for one child, live-in position, full room and board at a residence in Rosedale. The salary was more than she'd made in a year of shift nursing. All she had to do was sign an NDA the size of a small novel and never speak about her employer's affairs. She didn't know, when she pressed the pen to that paper, that she was walking into the world of Caius Merritt, the most quietly powerful man in Toronto, and arguably the most dangerous. She certainly didn't know that 8 weeks later, she'd be lying on a polished floor in a private clinic on Adelaide Street, bleeding from a wound in her side with a 7-year-old girl tucked beneath her and a gunshot still ringing in her ears. This is the story of how a laid-off pediatric nurse from Scarborough brought one of the most feared men in the country to his knees. The interview didn't happen in any office Harlow had ever seen. It happened in a suite on the 43rd floor of a glass tower overlooking Lake Ontario, with a man who introduced himself only as Mr. Harcourt, and who watched her the way a hawk watches something small crossing an open field. He was impeccably dressed. He looked at her resume with polite indifference, then set it down and looked at her instead. 4 years at Sick Kids. Then the merger. Restructuring, Harlow said. The position was eliminated. And since then, clinic work, part-time. I've been managing my grandmother's care in the interim. Your grandmother? She's in a facility. Trying to get her into one. Harlow kept her voice even. There's a wait list. In the meantime, she's with a private caregiver 3 days a week and with me the rest. The arrangement is, it's not sustainable. Mr. Harcourt folded his hands on the table. The salary we're offering is $12,000 a month, tax inclusive, with full accommodation at the Rosedale property. Your only expense will be whatever you choose to spend on yourself. The position is live-in, full-time, with 1 weekend per month off. Harlow did the math without meaning to. 12 months, her grandmother's care secured. The debt cleared. And the child? She asked. Her name is Cleo. She's 7. She lost her mother 14 months ago, a sudden illness. She's been through 3 caregivers since. She's not an easy child, Mr. Harcourt said carefully. She's frightened, and frightened children tend to lash out. I know, Harlow said. I spent 4 years on a pediatric ward. Fear looks a lot like anger from the outside. Something shifted in Mr. Harcourt's expression, barely perceptible, but there. He slid the NDA across the table. You will not discuss Mr. Merritt's business. You will not bring guests to the property. You will not contact the media or anyone outside the household regarding what you observe within it. He paused. This is not a standard employment contract, Miss Quaid. If you breach it, the legal consequences will be significant. If you breach it in certain other ways, the consequences will be of a different kind entirely. He didn't say it like a threat. He said it like a forecast. Harlow thought of her grandmother sitting in the same chair she'd sat in for 60 years, forgetting the names of her grandchildren one by one. She picked up the pen. Where do I sign? The Merritt property in Rosedale was not what Harlow had expected. She'd expected something cold, a modern fortress of concrete and glass with manicured grounds and security cameras on every corner. What she found was an older house, enormous but somehow warm, with climbing vines on the stone exterior and a kitchen that smelled of the previous evening's roasting. The housekeeper, Mrs. Galbraith, met her at the door. She was a compact woman in her late 60s with sharp eyes, and a manner that suggested she had seen everything and been unsurprised by most of it. She showed Harlow to a room that was larger than her entire apartment in Scarborough. She showed her the east wing and told her to stay in it. She showed her Cleo's room and told her not to knock unless she was prepared for something to be thrown. Mr. Merritt is rarely home before 9, Mrs. Galbraith said. He works, that is all he does. You'll see him perhaps twice a week if you are lucky. Does he spend time with Cleo? Mrs. Galbraith gave her a long look. He tries, she said finally, which told Harlow almost everything. Cleo was in the garden when Harlow found her, crouched behind an overgrown rosebush with her knees pulled to her chest. 7 years old, and she looked like she was holding herself together with sheer will. Brown eyes, serious and wary, a scab on her left knee, a book pressed against her chest like a shield. I know you're there, Cleo said, without turning around. I know, Harlow said. She sat down on the grass a few feet away and said nothing else. A long minute passed. The last one cried, Cleo said. The one before that tried to bribe me with stickers. I'm 7, not 4. What kind of stickers? Cleo finally turned, which I hate. What do you like? Beatles. Cleo said, as if expecting ridicule. Ground beetles or longhorns? Cleo stared at her. You know about beetles? I grew up in Scarborough. My gran had a garden. We used to catalogue everything we found in it. She had a notebook. Harlow kept her voice quiet, the way she used to on the ward when a child was scared. I still have it. I could bring it sometime if you wanted to see. Cleo looked at her for a long time. Then she stood up, brushed the grass off her jeans and said, Okay, but I'm not making any promises. It was, Harlow would later understand, the best possible start. She met Caius Merritt on her 5th night at the house. She'd gone down to the kitchen at 11:30 because she couldn't sleep, and she'd made the mistake of reading the care home's invoice on her phone. She was standing at the counter with both hands wrapped around a mug of tea when she heard the front door. Then voices, low and terse, and then the smell, metallic and sharp, underneath the aftershave. Blood. Harlow turned the corner and stopped. 3 men she didn't recognize were clustered around a 4th. The 4th was tall, considerably over 6 feet, dark-haired, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from something unkind. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than Harlow's monthly salary, and the left side of it was dark and wet. Every face in the hallway turned toward her. Get the doctor, the tall man said, his voice unhurried and low like the beginning of thunder. One of the men, blond, with a badly healed scar through his eyebrow, stepped forward. She saw. Donovan's going to have a problem with. No one, asked Donovan. The tall man pushed past the others with the controlled patience of someone accustomed to pain. He walked toward Harlow, limping slightly, his hand pressed against his ribs, but his eyes were steady, pale grey, the color of the lake in November. They did not look like the eyes of a man who was frightened. You're the nurse, he said. Not a question. Harlow Quaid, she managed. Caius Merritt. He stopped 2 feet from her. He was so close she could see the tension in the set of his mouth, the careful way he was breathing. You have 2 choices, Miss Quaid. You can pretend you didn't see anything tonight, or you can walk out that door and break the agreement you signed 3 days ago. I'd suggest the first option. You've been shot, Harlow said. I'm aware. Your doctor, is he a surgeon? He's adequate. She looked at his side. How long ago? A pause. 40 minutes. Then you need to move faster than you're moving. I'll set up in the kitchen. It's the brightest room. She looked at the man with the scar. Get me clean towels, a kettle going, and whatever first aid kit this house has. Now, please. The man looked at Caius. Caius looked at Harlow for a long moment. Do what she says. The next 3 weeks were a study in careful navigation. She learned quickly that the men who came and went from the house were not simply staff. She learned that the West Wing office was soundproofed. She learned that Caius Merritt was the kind of man about whom things were said in low voices and then stopped being said at all. She focused on Cleo. Cleo, it turned out, was not a difficult child. She was a child who had watched her mother die and had been handed from adult to adult, since, each one either overwhelmed or underprepared. She tested Harlow systematically and thoroughly, the way any intelligent, frightened creature tests new terrain. She knocked a mug off the table. She disappeared into the garden without warning. She told Harlow once very plainly that she didn't need a caretaker. I know, Harlow said, but your uncle does. Cleo looked at her. He doesn't act like it. He acts like someone who doesn't know how to ask for help, Harlow said. That's different from not needing it. Cleo thought about this for a long time. Then she went back to her beetle catalogue without another word. The breakthrough came on a Wednesday afternoon in the kitchen. Cleo had dragged a stool to the counter and was watching Harlow make soup, and she said, out of nowhere, she used to do this, my mum. She'd make soup and she'd let me stir it even though I always spilled. Harlow handed her the wooden spoon. You can spill here too. Cleo looked at the spoon. Then she looked at Harlow with an expression that was far too old for a 7-year-old. The others all said things like, your mum would want you to be happy, Cleo said. Like they knew her. I didn't know her, Harlow said. I'm sorry I didn't. Cleo stirred the soup. She spilled a little. She didn't apologize for it. It was, in a quiet way, a kind of beginning. The first time Harlow pushed back against Caius, she expected to lose her job. They were at dinner. A dinner she had essentially engineered by asking Mrs. Galbraith to set 3 places at the smaller table in the sitting room, on the grounds that Cleo was not going to eat another meal alone. Caius sat at the head of what was admittedly a very small table, his phone face up beside his plate, and Cleo ate in the careful silence of a child who had learned not to ask for too much. She's been asking about ice skating, Harlow said. Caius glanced up. She can go. I'll have someone take her. There's a rink on the harbour front. Public session on Saturday mornings. Harlow kept her voice conversational. "She wants to go with you." Something crossed his face. It wasn't irritation. It was closer to panic. "I have meetings Saturday morning." She told me her mum used to take her. Before, Harlow set down her fork. "She's been at this house for over a year, Mr. Merritt, and she's still figuring out whether she's allowed to want things from you. She's 7. She's not going to keep asking." The room was very quiet. Across the table, Cleo was staring at her soup bowl with the intense focus of someone pretending not to listen. Caius put down his phone. He looked at Cleo, then at Harlow. His expression was difficult to read, something complicated moving behind the grey. "Saturday," he said, "you'll both need warm coats." Cleo's face didn't change, but under the table Harlow felt small fingers close briefly around hers before letting go. Later that night, the man with the scarred eyebrow, whose name, she'd learned, was Donovan Galt, and who served as Caius's chief operating officer, stopped her in the corridor. He was handsome in an intentional way, polished and easy, and nothing about him felt safe. "You're getting very comfortable here," he said pleasantly. "I work here," Harlow said. "You're reordering his schedule, managing access to him. That's not caretaking, Miss Quaid." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Caius runs a complicated operation. He needs his focus. He doesn't need someone handing him a family and calling it good for him." "I'm not handing him anything," Harlow said. "I'm doing my job." "I'd be careful," Donovan said, "about what you think your job is." He walked away. Harlow stood very still and told herself it was only a warning. She didn't know yet that Donovan Galt had already made a call that morning to a man he was not supposed to know, about a schedule he was not supposed to share. Saturday was cold and bright, the lake throwing sparks of winter light across the harborfront ice. Cleo could barely skate. She gripped the boards and moved in shuffling increments and refused to take Harlow's hand on principle. Caius stood at the edge of the rink in a dark coat that looked entirely wrong in the context of a public skating session, watching his niece with an expression Harlow had not seen on him before. "She looks like her mother," he said very quietly, beside her. Harlow said nothing. She understood, from years on a pediatric ward, that some observations are not looking for a response. "I don't know how to do this," he said. It cost him something to say it. She could hear that clearly. "She doesn't need you to know how," Harlow said. "She just needs you to show up." On the ice, Cleo had let go of the boards. She was moving slowly, uncertainly, but moving, and she was looking at the two of them with her face luminous with something she was trying very hard not to show. Caius pushed off from the boards and stepped onto the ice. He was not a graceful skater. He was also not a man who did things tentatively. He crossed to Cleo in long, careful strides, and when he reached her, he said something Harlow couldn't hear. Cleo looked up at him, then she took his hand. They made 2 full circles of the rink like that, a large, careful man and a very small girl, and Harlow stood at the boards and felt something in her chest that she had no business feeling and chose not to examine it closely. On the drive back, Cleo fell asleep in the back seat. Caius looked at Harlow once from the front. "Thank you," he said. "It wasn't me," Harlow said. "It was you." He turned back to the road, but she saw the line of his jaw ease fractionally. When they reached the house, he carried Cleo inside without waking her. He tucked her in, clumsily, quietly, with the focused care of someone doing something new and not wanting to do it wrong. Harlow stood in the doorway and said nothing, because the moment didn't need her in it. 3 weeks later, Donovan Galt sold them out. Harlow didn't know this until the car in the clinic parking garage made its second slow pass. They were at a specialist appointment for Cleo, a routine follow-up, low security by any reasonable measure. Caius was a few minutes behind and had asked Harlow to bring Cleo up to the 4th-floor clinic while he parked. It was a private facility, quiet on a Tuesday afternoon. She had been here twice before. She noticed the car because it was moving wrong, too slow. The windows were down despite the cold. Something shifted in her chest, a reflex older than reason. The same thing that had made her sprint across a ward once when a monitor started beeping differently. "Cleo," she said, her voice quiet and even, "I need you to walk very quickly with me. Don't ask why." Cleo looked at her. She was a child who had learned to read adults. She took Harlow's hand without a word. They were almost at the clinic entrance when a man came down the emergency stairwell at speed. He saw them and raised what he was carrying anyway. Harlow didn't think. Thinking would have taken too long. She turned, sweeping Cleo behind her, and dropped to the floor, pulling the girl beneath her, arms locked over her, her body curved like a shell over something irreplaceable. The sound was enormous and wrong and very close. Then the burning started, a spreading, roaring heat across her right side below her ribs. She heard Cleo screaming her name. She heard running. She heard Caius's voice somewhere above and behind her, and it was the voice he used when he was past being controlled. Low and absolute and frightening in a way that had nothing to do with volume. She thought, the kid is safe. Then she stopped thinking. The private clinic on Adelaide Street existed functionally because men like Caius Merritt occasionally needed medicine outside of any system that asked questions. The surgeon who worked on Harlow said she was lucky. The bullet had cracked 2 ribs and nicked the edge of her lung. She had lost significant blood. She was young and strong. She would recover. Caius had not left. Donovan found him in the corridor 3 hours after surgery. He was still in the same coat, one hand braced against the wall, and he looked, not like a man in grief, like a man who had passed through grief and come out the other side into something colder and more permanent. "We need to talk about who gave Beauchamp the schedule," Donovan said. His voice was smooth. It had always been smooth. Caius looked at him. He had already spoken to 2 of Beauchamp's men before coming to the clinic. One of them had still been capable of answering questions by the end. The appointment schedule had existed in exactly 3 places: his own calendar, his assistant's, and Donovan's. "I know it was you," Caius said. Donovan's face didn't move. "That's a serious accusation. You should be careful." "She took a bullet that was meant for my niece." Caius stepped forward, and Donovan stepped back without meaning to. "She threw herself over a 7-year-old child. Because I trusted you to keep our movements private." His voice was barely above a murmur. It was worse for being quiet. "You sent someone to a medical appointment, Donovan." Cleo was standing 3 feet away. The woman was the problem. Donovan's composure cracked, just at the edges. "You've gone soft since she arrived. You're taking weekends, you're going skating. You're sitting at dinner like it's a normal house. I was protecting the organization." "You were protecting your position," Caius said. "You knew that if I stabilized, if I had something worth protecting, you'd lose your influence over me. So you hired someone to take her out and make it look random." He paused. "I trusted you for 11 years. Caius, don't." He said it once. Then he made a phone call, and Donovan Galt was escorted from the building in a way that did not invite further conversation. But Caius already knew what Donovan hadn't said aloud, that the man didn't act alone, that there was still a loose end, that a loose end to a man like Donovan had only one resolution. He cleared the floor. He turned off the corridor cameras. He left Harlow's room looking exactly as it had, dim, monitored, guarded by no one visible. Then he sat down in the corner of the room, in the shadow that the bedside light didn't reach, and he waited. 40 minutes later, the elevator at the end of the hall dinged softly. Footsteps followed, not heavy, measured, expensive shoes on polished linoleum. Someone who had spent a long time learning to move like he owned whatever room he entered. The door handle to Harlow's room turned slowly. Caius stayed very still. A man he recognized, one of Donovan's associates, someone who had eaten dinner at Caius's table and laughed at his jokes, stepped through the door and closed it behind him. He held a small case. He crossed to the bedside with the unhurried confidence of someone who had done this before and had not been caught. He reached for the IV line. "She's not yours to touch," Caius said from the dark. The man spun around. He reached inside his jacket. Caius crossed the room in 4 steps. What followed was brief and not pleasant to witness, and it ended with the man on the floor and Caius standing over him with the kind of expression that had, over the years, persuaded a great number of people to reconsider their choices. He called Luca, who handled the rest. Harlow woke up and did not know where she was. The ceiling was white and unfamiliar. The light was low. There was a steady mechanical beeping, and her right side felt like something had been wedged between her ribs and left there. She turned her head. Caius was in the chair beside the bed. He was still in his coat. He had not slept. His elbows were on his knees and his face was in his hands, and he was the first time since she'd known him, entirely without armor. He heard her move and looked up. "Cleo," she said. Her throat was very dry. "She's at the house. Mrs. Galbraith is with her." He poured water, held the straw to her lips. His hands were steady, but she could feel, in the careful way he moved, that they had not always been steady tonight. "She made you a card. It's mostly drawings of beetles." Harlow drank. "You stayed." "Yes." "You didn't have to." "I know." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the unguarded expression of someone who has stopped calculating and is simply present. "Why did you do it?" he said. "You could have pushed her behind something and run. You didn't have to." "She was right there," Harlow said. "I wasn't going to let her get hurt." "She's not your child." I know. A pause. She doesn't feel like mine, but she feels like mine to look after. I can't explain it better than that. He was quiet, his jaw worked. It was Donovan, he said finally. He sold the appointment time to the people I've spent years working against. He thought if you were gone, I'd go back to being the person I was before you arrived. He looked at her steadily. He was wrong. I don't want to go back. Harlow looked at the ceiling. She thought about her grandmother, about Cleo's fingers under the dinner table, about a man stepping onto uncertain ice and crossing to a little girl who needed him to show up. What happens now? She asked. You heal. He said it without hesitation. And when you do, I need to ask you something. I need to ask you to consider staying, not on the same terms, not as an employee. He stopped, choosing words with unusual care for a man who normally used very few, as part of the household. Properly, if you want it. That's a complicated offer, Harlow said, from a man whose professional life I still don't fully understand. No more secrets, he said. That's what I'm offering. If you stay, you know everything. What I do, what it costs, what the risks are. You don't go into anything blind. Harlow was quiet for a long time. She thought about the $47 in the care home invoice and the NDA the size of a phone book. She thought about all the reasonable ways her life could have gone. Then she thought about Cleo in her garden, and Cleo on the ice, and Cleo pressing small fingers against her hand at the dinner table, like she was checking whether Harlow was real. She thought about grey eyes watching a little girl skate for the first time in over a year, and something terrible and careful and human moving across a face that was almost never unguarded. Donovan, she said, you handle completely. Completely. She let out a slow breath. Then I'm staying. She shifted against the pillow, wincing at the pull of it. But we're writing a new agreement, and this time I read every page before I sign. Caius looked at her for a long moment. Something happened in his expression, quiet and enormous, and very carefully held. Name your terms, he said. The following spring, the garden at the Rosedale house was entirely different. The same stone walls, the same climbing vines. But the flower beds had been reorganized by a 7-year-old with strong opinions about which plants attracted the best beetles, and there was a small wooden habitat box near the east fence where Cleo was conducting, with complete scientific seriousness, a long-term study. It was a Saturday morning in late April, the kind of morning Toronto gives you rarely and perfectly, pale gold, cool, the lilac by the garden wall just coming into bloom. Harlow stood on the back terrace in a dress she had chosen without any particular agenda. Though Mrs. Galbraith had pressed it twice and told her she looked lovely and gone back inside before Harlow could argue. You're nervous, Cleo said, appearing at her elbow with a notebook and a pencil tucked behind her ear. I'm not nervous, Harlow said. Your left hand is doing the thing. Harlow looked down. Her left hand had curled slightly at her side. She uncurled it. A little nervous, she conceded. Cleo considered this with the gravity she brought to all important matters. He's more nervous than you, she said. Mrs. Galbraith said he's been up since 5. Harlow laughed and the nervousness eased. The ceremony was in the garden. Not a large affair. The guests were few, and most of them knew better than to ask questions about the circumstances. The man officiating was a judge who seemed genuinely moved by the occasion, which Harlow hadn't expected. Cleo served as witness in a yellow dress that she'd agreed to wear on the condition she could change back into jeans the moment the photographs were finished. When Harlow came down the garden path, no aisle, just flagstones between rose bushes. Caius was waiting near the lilac tree with his hands folded in front of him and an expression she had seen only twice before. Once at the edge of a skating rink, and once in a clinic room in the small hours of the morning when he had looked at her like she was the only thing in the room that mattered. He looked like a man for whom this was the most important thing that had ever required his full attention. She reached him. He took both her hands. His grip was warm and solid and certain. You came, he said very quietly. I told you I would. The judge spoke about love and commitment and the particular kind of courage it takes to choose someone fully, knowing the cost. Harlow listened, but she also felt the weight of Cleo pressed against her arm, small and warm and solid, and she thought that the vows had already been spoken. In a parking garage on a Tuesday afternoon, in a recovery room in the dark, at a kitchen counter over a wooden spoon, and at the edge of a skating rink on a cold October morning. Do you take this man? Clear, sure, without a single hesitation. Caius looked at her in the way she had come to understand, meant he was feeling a great deal more than he was showing. And do you? I do, he said every day. When the judge pronounced them married, Cleo made a small, quiet fist and pumped it downward once. in the manner of someone who has been waiting a long time for an outcome she was reasonably confident about. Caius pulled Harlow close and kissed her, and Mrs. Galbraith, near the terrace door, made a sound that was absolutely not a sniffle. Afterward, when the guests had moved toward the table under the walnut tree, Harlow and Caius stood alone for a moment near the lilac. She touched the scar at her side, the one she'd carry always, and thought, worth it. "What do we do now?" she asked. He looked at the garden. Cleo had shed the yellow dress in favor of the jeans she'd been wearing underneath it. She had apparently come prepared, and was already crouched beside the habitat box with her notebook, entirely absorbed. "Now," Caius said, "we have lunch, and then she's going to tell us everything she found in that box." Harlow smiled. She had come to this house with $47 and a notebook full of her grandmother's careful handwriting, looking for a way to survive. She had found, instead, a child who catalogued beetles, a man who learned to show up for the right reasons, and a life that was entirely unexpectedly hers. She had bled for it. She would not trade a single moment.